Welcome back to the Engineered Angler. I'm here doing something just a little different. I'm carving on jig heads that come really blank and really sort of boring looking. Now I know what you guys are thinking, why don't I just carve it into a piece of wood, make a mold, and then I can repeat the same shape over and over by just pouring my own jig heads. Well, I just have an aversion to melted lead. I don't like having a pot of molten lead sort of vaporizing and filling my little tiny space with lead vapors. But hey, you know, if you've got the space and you got the ventilation, certainly do it. But I thought, you know, this would be a little bit of an exploration of my carving technique, whatever I have of it. I really like jigs that have some texture, or preferably some really nice detail. It doesn't take a whole lot of tools or a whole lot of know-how, and if you're sitting up north waiting for things to thaw out, this is a really nice little project, so stick around. Well, the technique is pretty simple, and I'm not an artist or much of a carver, but I can get a halfway decent result. This technique can give you some pretty nice detail, and you can enhance that with texture easily added. And I'll show you how I add some texture in a little bit. So the first thing you're going to need is some kind of a drawing of the details that you want on that jig head. It's simple enough, and it's better to go ahead and draw in what you want to carve first, just so you have the same on both sides too. And just using this piece of glass, let's imagine that this is the jig head, and here, there you go. I always like to start with the gill plates, and this way it gives me an idea of how much material I'm actually going to take off. So I'll come back and do something like this, and you can do a double gill plate if you want to. Not really necessary, but you can lay in a second gill plate and maybe put in some lines. Kind of looks kind of cool. And then at that point, I want to put in an eye, just so I don't carve into an area that I want to put an eye in. Now, you don't have to put a hole or an indentation or an eye socket, whatever you want to call it. You can always just glue your eye straight onto the surface. And then the next thing I like to do is make sure I have a mouth, and I usually like to run it down. So I like to be sure that I get a good kind of pronounced lower lip, and that's about as much as I want to go ahead and do. And then from there you can add texture and paint. Now there's two ways to get that drawing onto your head. You can just freehand it on there, or you can go ahead and make a template. Let me show you how I make templates. I like to use this HVAC ducking tape. It's easy to use, it's cheap to get, and it's real handy for a lot of other things if you foil lures and all that kind of stuff. Plus it works out real good if you need to seal a duct. So what I'll do is I'll cut a piece that is twice as big as the head of the jig. I'll fold it over with the backing towards me. And the nice thing is this is paper backing, and so you can draw right on it. I'll go ahead and just trace the general shape, and if I have to refine it afterwards, that's easy enough. I'll go ahead and draw in my gill plates. I'll put in my eye, and then put in that mouth. Now what I want to do is I want to go over my lines with a pen, and you want to put something underneath it that isn't hard as glass. So a piece of wood works, a piece of cardboard that's hard works pretty well. And the idea is to go over the lines that you've drawn with the ballpoint pen pretty firmly. And so now what you end up with is that shape embossed in the aluminum. So all that's left to do is cut it out and place it on your jig head. Now we'll just place it on here. Make sure we have enough material to work with. I don't try to stick it on there really firmly because I want to pull it off afterwards. Now it's just a matter of getting these lines marked into your jig head, and I like to do it with a little knife, and it goes pretty quickly. You just can't be too picky about how accurate you are with your lines. And so the idea is to press hard enough to get it marked into the lead, but that's all you need. Then you can just pull all this stuff off. And it's a matter of just repeating it on the other side. So the other technique is to just draw it directly on the jig head. And that's kind of my preferred technique, mostly because I don't really expect perfection anyway. And I just like to sort of free draw and see how it goes. And I'll just go through the same process I did with the foil. Now you'll notice that I'm wearing gloves. It's a good idea to wear gloves whenever you're dealing with lead, especially if you're going to be handling it a lot. And with this, we'll be carving and sanding. So when it gets to the point where I'm actually sanding it, I'm going to wear a dust mask. And I really recommend you do the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to establish a couple of points where I know I want to start both sides so I can have them more or less symmetric. So that'll be the top of the gill plate, and then I'll put the mouth all the way across the front here, and that'll make it a lot easier for me to have it be symmetric, right? I'm going to establish like the farthest point back, and I'll do the same thing on this side, and I'll come in all the way down to the center line over here. And then with the lip, it's just a matter of sort of freehanding some sort of mouth shape. So that's a pretty good start on the details. I just need to repeat this on the other side and we'll get started on the carving. So before we start carving, I just wanted to show you that this is the one I just did freehand, and this one is the one I did with the foil, and I put a little bit of ink so you can see the knife marks, but you can see how similar they are. So really, the technique with the least amount of work is the way to go. So I like to start carving with the same technique as I would use with any other material, especially wood. I'm just going to come in here, and I know what I need to take out. I'm going to start working on the lip, on the mouth part of it, and I know that I want to leave that lower lip kind of sticking out a little bit, so I'm going to take a little off the top. And just like wood, you got to be careful not to overcarve and take off what you want to leave. So I'll come in and I'll carve away from my carving line, and then you can sand in a little farther. So I like to just mark in my lines with the blade, try to cut in as deep as I can with one run. So if you look at this carving, the one I originally did, you can see I came in under the chin and kind of hollowed it out a little bit. Makes it look a little more realistic. And this gives you a really nice opportunity to practice your carving for when it really is going to end up being a master for a mold. So I just get my lines cut in, and then I start cutting into that line, taking out material. And once I have a good line set up, it basically acts like a limiter or like a point of reference and a barrier to keep you from going beyond it. Once I have that all established, I'll come in with some kind of sanding tool and work my way in. You can use these little sanding boards. I really like them because they let you sort of lean into the spot you've already carved and just start sanding away material. Or you can make your own with a popsicle stick and just wrap it in sandpaper and do the same thing. Of course, power tools are an option, right? You can use a Dremel. The only thing I would caution you with the Dremel is a Dremel tends to want to jump around on you. I try to use it really sparingly, and I know there's a hollow I want to carve out right here. That little hollow really kind of rounds out the shape of the lower lip and gives it a little more natural look. The carving actually goes pretty fast, but I'll speed it up here just so we don't belabor this. It doesn't take too long to get a lot done. So at some point you'll find yourself carving some really tight locations, and sometimes it's better not to carve but to actually gouge. And what I like to use is a pointy ended file or anything hard with a good pointed edge, and you can sort of plow out the material out of those tight little grooves. So having some small files really is a benefit. You can go in there and get to those tight corners and refine your carving marks, and you'll find it goes a little quicker if you've got those little files. So once you've carved as much reveal as you want into the details, you can then consider whether you want to go ahead and put eye sockets in. So I'm going to do it just so that you can see it done. It's a little bit of a pain in the butt because it's easy to run outside your little perimeter, and then we'll do a final little buffing off with a little piece of wool, steel wool. You can also use buffing wheels with your Dremel. And I'm going to sand off some of these carving marks. How many of these carving marks you sand off is up to you. How much detail you put in is up to you. I find that just a little neatness is a little better. So I'll sand it a little more, but let's get to the eyeballs. On the last one, I just did it with the Dremel with a little cylinder bit here, and this sort of made the size I wanted by hand. This is a little tricky to do it that way. It's easier to do it with the drill, but the problem with the drill is you do end up losing a bunch of material. Now, I just want to make a little bit of a socket just so that eyeball I put on there sets in the head just a little bit. All right, let's buff it, and we'll start with the painting process. So buffing it with a little bit of this 4/0 steel wool works really well, and it gives it that kind of a, I don't know, pewter look. Well, pretty happy with that. Nice detail, some pretty nice detail, and nicely sort of buffed out. Let me show you one more little trick to give it a little more life, and that is putting a little bit of texture on it. It's nice to have a little bit of texture, make it look like it has a little bit of a subtle look of scales. And what I like to use is something with some knurling on it. And you can see this has a little bit of knurling. So what I'm going to do is just start right above the eye and just run this pattern across. Now you got to push pretty hard to get it in there, but I think it looks pretty cool after you're done. And then I'll just run it back a little bit on the top. When you run it on there, you got to roll it so it doesn't just scrape. It actually lays in that pattern. If you look close, you'll see I got a little bit of texture just above the eye, and I think it'll give it a little more character. All right, let's go to the paint booth and paint these guys. Well, let me just say the obvious here. You can leave it like this. You can just add an eye and maybe even give it some highlight painting with some Sharpies or whatever paint you're comfortable painting with if you don't have an airbrush. But we're going to paint ours, and I'm going to start by first getting some highlights in these carvings. So I'm going to go ahead and start out with some black paint, and then I'll wipe it off and just leave it in the bottom of the carvings. Alright, let's move on to some color. Alright, let's start with a little white on the bottom. Alright, now I'm going to use a little bit of gold, metallic gold around the face and a little bit on the jaw. Alright, now I'm going to go with a little fluorescent orange on the bottom, just to give it a little bit of glow in the water. And now a bit of pearl red. I'm going to put it a little bit back here too, give it that bleeding gill look. Alright, now I'm going to hit it with some pearlescent blue right on top. The texture will show through. Okay, pretty happy with the way this looks. Like the colors, and it's ready for some eyes. I'm going to use some 3D. These are kind of holographic silver. And we'll drop those right in place. And that really comes to life with these eyes. Well, you gotta admit, that's quite the transformation for that really basic jig. Let's go ahead and put some clear coat. So for a clear coat, I'm gonna use UV clear, and then I'm gonna stick it in my UV turner, and hopefully it's not too cold for this stuff to set up quickly. Now, if you don't have a way to clear coat this way, the best thing to do is to protect the paint with a spray enamel or a spray lacquer, and that usually does a pretty nice job. You don't have to go through all the trouble of having a setup for UV. Alright, I'm pretty happy with that. That looks pretty cool. Just a matter of getting it to harden. So I've got it in there. I'm going to turn the lights on, and we'll come back to it in about 30 minutes. Okay, should be done. And you gotta love that. Look at that. From that humble beginning of just a slug of lead to a nice looking jig head. So it took me about 25 minutes to actually do the carving, and then the painting, it's optional, but that probably took me another 20 minutes as well. At the end, there'll be a little bit of a slideshow showing the 3 stages of the creation of this. I know you can buy jig heads just as nice as this, but it just makes a difference when you make it yourself. But thank you to everybody for watching, and if you're enjoying this stuff, subscribe. And if you have friends that you think would enjoy this kind of stuff, share this with them. I'm trying to build the channel and get it going a little bit. So I'll catch you on the next video.